Now let's move on from the tube to the membrane. Assalamu alaikum, this is Dr. Hasna with Hasna's Anatomy, and today we're discussing the tympanic membrane. We've already talked about the external ear, so definitely go check that part out before you get into this part, because a lot of it is interrelated to each other. So do not forget to subscribe to my channel, and let's get started with the tympanic membrane. Now the tympanic membrane lies at that boundary where the external ear is about to meet your middle ear, that is lying over here. So this right here is the tube of the external acoustic meatus. This is the tympanic membrane. Behind it is the middle ear. Obviously, the tympanic membrane is quite smaller than this, probably microscopic compared to this. But obviously, for better understanding, I've made it a huge oval, and I really hope I've made it as perfect of an oval as I could. The tympanic membrane is basically forming the lateral wall of the middle ear. That makes complete sense because obviously anything that's over here, this is going to be its lateral part, and that is the tympanic membrane. So the interesting part about the tympanic membrane is not just kept like that, rather it's kept a little bit at an angle to the if we compare in relation to the floor of the external auditory meatus. This angle is the 55-degree angle, and you can see that this part is directed downwards and laterally. Now the interesting part about the tympanic membrane is that it has an outer surface and an inner surface. Alright, now let me explain how the tympanic membrane actually works. So you can see this is all around tympanic membrane that is attached to the temporal bone. We all know the temporal bone is actually where the ear is basically existing. Now the outer surface is actually lined by thin skin. Inner part is going to be giving attachment to the bone of the middle ear known as the malleus. How is this membrane exactly attached? Around the temporal bone there is a tympanic sulcus that is giving attachment to the margins or circumference of this entire tympanic membrane. Makes sense? This entire sulcus is giving it attachment, so the periphery of this tympanic membrane is actually quite thickened at this circumference, so it can be attached to the tympanic sulcus. Now what happens superiorly, the sulcus is deficient. The sulcus is not there. So this area between the two ends of the sulci, this area is known as a tympanic notch. Now since this tympanic membrane is going to be attached here loosely, it is going to result in two folds or two bands being formed anteriorly and posteriorly. So the anterior band that is formed is known as the anterior malleolar fold, and posterior is known as the posterior malleolar fold. Why do we call them malleolar? They have to do something with our malleus bone, right? So you can see the malleus bone is basically posterior to the or deep to the outer surface. I'm going to show it to you over here. Basically what happens is these folds extend up to the lateral processes of the malleus bone, and therefore it is known as the malleolar fold because they're extending till the lateral process of that malleus. Due to these two folds, the entire membrane, you can see it's being divided into a lower and a small upper part, right? Now this lower part has this personality or trait that it always remains stressed out. It's always tensed. Therefore, this outer part or this majority of the portion of the tympanic membrane is known as the pars tensa. This part lying between the two malleolar folds above it, this is going to be very loose and very relaxed about life, not too stressed, So that part is known as the pars flaccida. A very important thing related to the pars flaccida is that the chorda tympani nerve passes right behind it. So whenever you see a pars flaccida, just behind or deep to the pars flaccida is going to be the chorda tympani nerve, and we all know that was the branch of the facial nerve carrying taste fibers. Alright, so that nerve is related to the pars flaccida. And quite interestingly, the pars flaccida is actually more prone to getting ruptured whenever there is any damage to the tympanic membrane. What happens is your tympanic membrane at all times has this pull on it. Alright, it's literally like that. The outer surface is concave, whereas the inner surface is convex. And how is this pull being created? It is due to the tensor tympani muscle that is basically lying, this is the malleus. It is lying at the upper end of the malleus, it's attached to the malleus, and it is causing this pull that allows your outer surface to remain concave. Now I want you to remember this concavity of the tympanic membrane is maximum at this point at the tip of the handle of the malleus bone. At this point, it is maximum concave. This point is known as the umbo, the part of the maximum concavity. And what is its landmark? It is lying at the tip of the handle of the malleus bone. Let's talk about a little bit of the structure of the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane is formed by outer, middle, and inner layers. The The outer layer is basically the cuticular layer, which contains mostly the skin. The middle layer is actually the fibrous layer, consisting of two different kinds of fiber, one lying superficially, one lying deep. The superficial fibers are actually radiating fibers. And why do we call them radiating? Because they're radiating around the handle of the malleus, all right? So you can see these are the superficial radiating fibers, and deep to them are going to be the circular fibers, all right? In pars flaccida, this middle fibrous layer is just replaced by loose areolar tissue. And then finally, we have this inner mucus layer, which is obviously going to be seen in the inner surface. Inner mucus layer is basically made up of ciliated columnar epithelium. When we pull our ear upwards, backwards, and laterally, and we visualize the tympanic membrane by means of illumination or a light, what do we see? We do not see the entire tympanic membrane. What we see is cone of light that is being formed on the antero-inferior quadrant of the tympanic membrane. So this area right here is all we can see, and the apex of this cone you can see is formed by the umbo, or the tip of the handle of the malleus bone. Through the membrane, you can also visualize the structures lying behind the membrane. Just like you can see, suppose this is the outside of the membrane. It's not that the malleus is lying over here. Rather, it's actually, you can see, because you can see it through this membrane. You can see the handle of the malleus, and you can also visualize the long process of the incus behind. Now at times what happens is middle ear is full of pus and you want to relieve that pus. So what you do is make a incision to drain out the pus. This procedure is known as meningotomy. Incision is usually made in the posterior inferior quadrant of the tympanic membrane. Why? Because we do not want to damage the pars flaccida, so we remain in the inferior area. And still, even when we perform the meningotomy, there are chances that we can actually rupture the chorda tympani nerve in any way. This can cause the loss of taste in the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and even your salivation may be stopped due to the supply it gives to submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. Now, if we talk about the nerve supply of the tympanic membrane, I want you to divide the entire tympanic membrane into an antero-inferior quadrant and a postero-superior quadrant. Antero-inferior, postero-superior quadrant. And right now we're talking about the outer surface. Now, whatever is outside, and I've already told you in the previous video, you're going to add two nerves. One is the AT and one is the AV. AV, AVAT. These are the auricular branch of the vagus, AV, and the auriculotemporal nerve will always be supplying the outside area mostly, all right? So this auriculotemporal nerve will be supplying the antero-inferior quadrant, whereas the auricular branch of the vagus nerve will be supplying the posterior-superior area, and finally the inner surface will be supplied by the tympanic branch of the 9th nerve. This is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And with that, we reach the end of the tympanic membrane. Really hope you understood the concept. In the next video, I will discuss the middle ear. So stay tuned for that intense topic. Until then, thank you so much for watching.